Hello everyone, my name is Sally Alm and I'm currently studying a bachelor's in politics and sociology. I've been a volunteer at Plover Rovers for a few months now, and with that I help to create these webinars on different topics. And this webinar will dive into the topic of marine justice and how we can apply this perspective to better understand the social and political impacts of marine issues. It's a concept that's just recently started gaining traction, and a few NGO ocean initiatives have begun to incorporate it into their research and policy suggestions. So first of all, here's a quick summary of what the webinar will entail. To begin with, I'll introduce the concept of marine justice and what it actually means, so that we then can begin to use it as an analytical frame. Then I'll go into some specific problems where this perspective is especially crucial, which includes sea level rise, the global fishing industry, and ocean grabbing. There'll also be an opportunity in the end where you can share your thoughts on this topic and how you believe marine justice can be implemented in practice and policy. So let's get into it. What is marine justice? Marine justice, also known as ocean justice, is a bridging concept that combines social equity with marine studies. It emerged quite recently from the wider movement of environmental justice, which highlights how environmental issues are inherently linked with social, political, and economic issues. As an analytical frame, marine justice helps us understand the social and political dimensions of marine issues in particular. It especially looks at how the burden of environmental problems is unequally distributed across populations, based on factors such as race, class, ethnicity, age, and gender. As we know, it is the marginalized and poorest communities who have contributed the least to climate change, who also face the harshest consequences. And this is true for ocean-related issues as well. And these issues include sea level rise, overfishing, flooding, ocean pollution, water scarcity, and other coastal and marine issues. Here's a quote from marine biologist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's one of the main advocates for the marine justice movement. When we think about ocean conservation, it can't just be for the spots in front of fancy resorts or the homes of wealthy individuals. We should also be thinking about not just who bears the brunt of the impact on the ocean, but who gets benefit when we do take care of it. Here, Johnson sums up the twofold aim of marine justice: first, examining who is unequally impacted by marine issues, and two, who is benefiting from conservation efforts. All right, so now that we have a bit of a better grasp on what the marine justice perspective is, we can begin to apply it to real-world issues. So, rising sea levels. We know that rising sea levels is a huge issue that will only get worse the longer it takes for us to lower our emission and reach carbon neutrality. This problem can be looked at both globally and regionally, so that's what we'll be doing now. On a global scale, rising sea levels is a pressing issue that is unequally affecting different countries based on their geography, GDP, level of development, and infrastructure, for example. It is small island states and countries that are the least developed that are the most vulnerable to this. An example is a country like the Netherlands versus Bangladesh. Both of these countries are affected by rising sea levels. However, the Netherlands is one of the most effective flood control networks in the world, which has been able to invest in due to its resources and capital. Bangladesh does not have adequate support to implement such adaptation methods, and are therefore much more vulnerable. Furthermore, Bangladesh also faces issues such as riverbank erosion, river flooding, and drought and storms. There has been attempts by the UN Framework for Climate Change to tackle these global inequalities, such as the Green Climate Fund. These aim to support frontline communities with the money and resources they require to tackle these catastrophes. However, it is still not at the level of what the least developed countries are fighting for within international negotiations. A big part of marine justice is therefore about distributive justice, which attempts to level the global playing field and make sure that current inequalities aren't exacerbated by climate change. Besides global distributive justice, marine justice must also mean migrant justice. We know that millions of people are at risk of becoming climate refugees in the coming decades. Making sure that refugees and migrants are included in our struggle for equality is therefore detrimental. A way this could be done is through an international agreement on the legal recognition, protection, and assistance of climate refugees around the world. Besides from this, sea level rise also unequally affects populations within a nation, so on a national and regional scale. Demographic categories such as socioeconomic status, race, gender, ability, and age all influence climate change vulnerability and impacts, and that is true for sea level rise as well. For example, many flood zones have a lot of low-income housing. In order to address these disparities, we therefore have to fight for people's human rights and build social support systems that make sure that no one is left behind when catastrophe strikes. So, moving on to the global fishing industry, which is another crucial area that we can use discussing marine justice. We know that about 3 out of 7 people globally rely on seafood as a primary source of animal protein, which shows how important the fishing industry is in many places. However, this industry is plagued by a lot of human rights abuses. An example is the brutal treatment of deckhands and migrant workers, who are often classified as modern slaves. You can read more about this in this book called The Outlaw Ocean by Urbina, which talks about how these workers often have no access to basic human rights like medical care, how they sometimes receive no pay at all, and are often beaten for small transgressions. There's also been instances where captains have murdered their workers. Furthermore, the workers often have exploitative contracts and have their passports taken away from them, which leaves them with no support and no way to escape their situation. The book also mentions how annual profits from sea slavery averages at $124 billion per year, which shows how extensive this terrible practice is. Another example of this injustice is that small-scale fishers often have very little power in decision-making processes. Instead, levels of control is in the hands of industrial fishing companies in Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. This is often done in an attempt to manage overfishing, but can end up punishing local communities. Next, I'll go a bit deeper into the importance of small-scale fisheries and how their rights can be supported. So, the importance of small-scale fisheries. The Global Partnership for Small-Scale Fisheries has found that these fisheries have a vast contribution to societies on both the social, cultural, and political level. As this illustration shows, small-scale fisheries are much more beneficial in almost all categories compared to large-scale fisheries. These include local employment, local food security, women involvement, and cultural heritage. The report also found that small-scale fisheries, if appropriately supported and adequately invested in, can help achieve real sustainable development in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. However, at the moment, the majority of small-scale fisheries are governed through centralized mechanisms that limit the capacity for building strong organizations. We therefore need to fight to put power back into local fishing communities in order for a more participatory and democratic fishing industry that supports their well-being and cultural heritage, as well as supporting biodiversity. In this way, putting power back into small-scale fisheries is an important aspect towards fighting toward marine justice for all. A way that small-scale fishing communities are suffering from injustice is through a process called ocean grabbing. Ocean grabbing is when access and control is taken away from small-scale fishers and their communities. And it is occurring mainly through policies, laws, and practices that are redefining and reallocating access, control, and use of resources. And what is tragic about these policies is that they make ocean grabbing legally permissible, even though it severely harms local fishermen. In 2012, ocean grabbing entered a new and heightened phase with the emergence of the Global Partnership for Oceans. And this partnership is a World Bank-led initiative which seeks the privatization of property right regimes to aquatic resources and top-down market-based conservation efforts. As I said earlier, this is usually done in an attempt to manage overfishing and support conservation. However, it ends up punishing the small-scale fishers who often fish in a much more sustainable manner than industrial companies. It also undermines the rights and cultures of millions of people that depend on these small-scale fisheries. This quote is from Secretary General of the World Forum of Fisher People, which perfectly sums up the issue of ocean grabbing. The quote reads, "The term conservation carries a negative connotation for millions of local fisherfolks around the world, as it means we have to give up on most of our livelihoods and income from fishing while we draw no benefit from conservation efforts." Of course, this does not mean that conservation efforts aren't important. Instead, it stresses that we need to critically examine how we impose conservation projects, as well as to analyze the social and political impacts of them, both on the short term and the long term. The first step in addressing this is, of course, to give local fishermen a greater voice in conservation efforts, making processes more democratic, and embracing a perspective on conservation that is inclusive and mutually beneficial. In order to understand how ocean grabbing looks like in practice, I want to look at an example, which is the Langeban Lagoon Marine Protected Area in South Africa. This marine protected area was established by the government in cooperation with international NGOs, but with no prior consultation with the local communities that have fished in these waters for generations. It is a highly controversial marine protected area, as banning fishing led many local fishers to being dispossessed from their communities. Instead of markets where fisherfolk used to sell their daily catches, the coastline is now developed for foreign-owned tourism with holiday homes and luxury restaurants. In this picture, you see a demonstration from the women within the community protesting against the ocean grabbing and calling for the protection of their livelihoods and restoration of their dignity, as well as their coastal land back. Sadly, this tragedy is not an isolated one. Documented experiences from places such as Tanzania, Thailand, the Philippines, India, and Mexico has shown that marine protected areas often end up excluding small-scale fishers and depriving them of livelihoods, with no support on how to manage this change. We therefore need to work on how to make marine protected areas more democratic and more beneficial for all parties involved. So what are the takeaways from these examples? I would say some of the most important aspects of marine justice is the need to listen, support, and uplift the people worst affected. This includes groups such as World Forum for Fisher Peoples, which is a social movement that represents over 10 million fisher people from all over the world. Second of all, to critically examine conservation efforts from multiple perspectives. This could include measures such as aiming for a more bottoms-up approach to conservation, where local fishers have a much greater voice in decision-making processes. It also means including social data in conservation efforts, not just scientific data. Thirdly, it includes advocating for a more just regulation and enforcement that protects human rights. Example of this is to reform fisheries management and implement laws that protect climate refugees and victims of sea slavery. There's also a more philosophical approach, which is that we need to see the oceans as a part of the global commons and completely transform our relationship with the oceans. However, this might be a difficult task to implement in practice and might take decades. So now that I've discussed this concept a little bit and hopefully shown that it can lead to a very crucial perspective on marine issues, I wanted to create a bit of a dialogue on how marine justice can actually be implemented in policy and practice. So I would love to hear if anyone has any thoughts on this. Do you think it's possible to embrace marine justice on a policy level? Do you find it a useful perspective? Can you think of other areas where this perspective is needed? Any thoughts or questions at all are welcome.